All right, welcome back to this week's episode of the You Can't Work podcast. The podcast where we say you can't work in healthcare until you understand this week's topic, power and medicine. I am joined by a very special guest to discuss today's topic. Everyone, give a round of applause to today's guest, Dr. Michel Foucault. Yes, thank you for having me. It is an honor to be featured on a podcast I have never heard of before. Right. Anyway, since you're not alive anymore, why don't you give us a little introduction about yourself and why you, of all people, can educate us about the topic of power and medicine? I was alive between the years 1926 and 1984. I was most well known for working as a philosopher at the Collège du France. Amazing. Where's that place located? Anyway, most of my research was focused on studying the relationship between knowledge and power, how possessing the former can give you the latter when it comes to controlling the liberty of others. Spooky. Well, you know the name of the podcast and all, but I'll ask you anyway. How does this relate to medicine? Why should we learn about it before we begin a career in healthcare? When you work as a health professional, you must understand that you have power over your patients. They come into your office and they do not have the same knowledge and therefore power that you do. There is a clear division among everyone in medicine based on their race, gender, socioeconomic status, and anything else they may identify with. It is an invisible phenomenon that influences the way you act as a professional over others. You may think that we have progressed into a society of equality, but there are still disparities everywhere you look. You don't say. Why don't you give us some examples about these disparities you're talking about? Of course. I mean, Google is free and all, but I will enlighten you anyway on some of the more obvious areas where we see disparities. Let us start with the official 2023 Physician Compensation Report. Just from taking a quick glance through the report, we can see that in almost every specialty, men are making much more than women, up to 10%. That is a crime, no? Well, you can call that a robbery. Now that you've mentioned it, I do remember that we've been talking about the gender pay gap for the past 20 plus years. There was even a study published in 2011 where they found that the starting salary between male and female physicians right outside of residency in New York had a difference of over $16,000. Exactly. You would expect the gender pay gap to be closing at a faster rate now. There are many more issues between male and female physicians, but I will spare you the details and we can instead focus on the patients, since they have the least power in healthcare. While I want to dive more into the depths of my research, I will educate you on some of the more basic principles since you are slow-minded. Philosophically, objectification and subjectification are different terms, and I will teach you about the difference between them. Objectifying one means to treat them as a simplified version of themselves, like a permanent object that does not have the capacity to change. On the other hand, subjectifying one means that we are assigning our own learned values onto that thing, whether it is ourselves or others. Beauty pageants typically objectify women into a single set of criteria, whether that is beauty, humanity, or general knowledge. In our society, there are so many standards women typically feel pressure to reach for, so they feel like they can have value. Whereas men don't really have this issue. Women can cultivate these standards into their own subjective thoughts, and their actions and desires can reflect these thoughts. Well, women aren't the only ones with standards to live up to. I see attractive male actors in movies all the time, and that's kind of a standard that men have to live up to and can even feel insecure about. How does this even relate to medicine? The difference between men and women here isn't even close, and I was about to circle back to medicine before you rudely interrupted me. My apologies, please continue. Since you want to turn this into a gender war, I will humor you and even counter your arguments. First of all, male representation in media, more than often than not, empowers males and presents them with standards to achieve. It is why the most popular portrayals of male in media are nearly superhuman. In contrast, females are constantly bombarded with the most extreme displays of outer beauty that appeal to the main demographic of the world, men. If the patriarchy did not continue to approve and support these portrayals of female beauty, then it wouldn't become the norm and women wouldn't feel pressured to achieve these unrealistic standards. The radical lesbian feminist and theologian Mary Daly would agree with me here. She even has a quote that says, "Filled with inspired fixations, women check to see if their hair, eyebrows, lashes, lips, skin, buttocks, breasts, stomachs, hips, legs, and feet are satisfactory." In society today, women are still preoccupied with all of the advertising on how they can improve their looks. They can become obsessed and undergo unnecessary cosmetic procedures, dieting, obsessive exercise, and many other activities risking their physical and mental health to look their very best, while men rarely consider these routes. That is just so wild to hear it being said out loud. I've seen so many female beauty advertisements so far in my life that I've become desensitized to how it can even affect a woman. It feels crazy to know I've been ignorant about it this whole time. I'm sorry, women. I'm sure they will forgive you as soon as you dismantle the patriarchy. Would you like to hear some historical observations Dr. Mary Daly made while studying the history of gynecology? Your excitement scares me, but fire away. Fantastic. During the development of gynecology through the early 19th century, Dr. Isaac Bacon Brown invented the clitoridectomy. You can already guess what the procedure entails, but it was advocated for as a cure to female masturbation. What is even crazier is that sometime after this procedure was invented, Dr. Robert Batty conceived female castration as a procedure where one would remove a woman's ovaries to cure her insanity. You can imagine how fast they shut down the idea of male castration to cure male insanity, though. That is terrible. My jaw hit the floor, and it's still dropping farther than that. I have one more observation. J. Marion Sims, the father of gynecology, wanted to perfect his techniques for his white patients, so he decided that vulnerable slaves were the perfect group of people to experiment on. Looking back at my research, this serves as a perfect example of knowledge and power being abused to objectify other humans based on their race, gender, and class, all at the same time. Right. I remember you bringing that up at the start of this episode. While I can't wait to hear you talk more about your research, I was wondering if you had any examples in our current time where patients were being treated differently in medicine based on their race. I will keep it brief so I can talk about my research soon, though. It is no surprise that American history is filled with racism towards African slaves and African Americans to this day. The textbook example of poor treatment towards this population is the Tuskegee Syphilis study. Am I saying that right? This study occurred across the mid-20th century, where an entire county in Alabama was observed to watch the progression of syphilis until death. It happened over the course of 40 years, where study participants thought they were coming in to be treated for their bad blood, but no treatment was ever being administered to them. Penicillin even became a viable treatment option to them halfway through the study in the 50s, but these African American men were deemed ineligible for the drug by the researchers. Many of them perished without ever knowing they could have gotten proper treatment and lived longer. Did anyone go to jail over this study? Everyone allowed this to happen for 40 whole years? Nothing happened to the researchers, and they were able to profit off of the many papers they wrote about their observations. Nowadays, we understand that there are clear ethical violations when it comes to this study. These African American men were disadvantaged and clearly selected because they did not have the knowledge or power to get the medicine they needed. While this study seems like a dark mistake researchers have made in the past, think again. We are still venturing into morally gray medical practices when it comes to researching medicine. There are currently researchers testing out the potential of artificial blood substitutes in patients who need blood transfusions. These patients aren't conscious enough to sign on to the study and give their consent. There are those advocating for the study saying that the risks are worth the reward, but we've heard that so many times over and over, it's become a broken record. Well, I guess you can say that we still have a long way to go as a society to make medicine and knowledge equally accessible so that professionals don't abuse their power. I'm glad you understand. Now we can get into my research. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the You Can't Work podcast. I will see you all next week.